Hello, everyone. I'm Emily Galpern on behalf of the Center for Genetics and Society. We're waiting just a few more minutes before we get started while more people join. This webinar will be accessible to blind and visually impaired people, so we'll be audio describing our slides, which means reading the titles and all words on the slides and describing all images. And this will also be possible for folks on the phone to know what we're seeing. Right now on the slide, it says Gene Editing and the Future of Reproductive Justice Webinar, Tuesday, June 13th, 2017. Below that, there are pictures of each of our three speakers with their names and affiliations. Lisa Ikemoto, UC Davis, Ruha Benjamin, Princeton University, and Dorothy Roberts, University of Pennsylvania. Below that, it reads, if you need help with Adobe Connect, call or email Leah Lothorpe at 1-510-665-7760, extension 308. On the right side of the screen, if you are online, you'll see a box that says Troubleshooting. Use this box if you have any issues you need help with on the Adobe Connect platform. We'll get started in just a few moments. We're recording the webinar to share with those who cannot participate today and for those of you on the phone who would like to see the video later, and we'll send out the link in the next 2 to 3 weeks. I'd like to turn it over to Narbese.
Thank you, Emily. Hello and welcome everyone to Gene Editing and Reproductive Justice webinar. Again, my name is Narbese Flint and I'm the Policy Director and I would say resident nerd here at Black Women for Wellness in Los Angeles. Black Women for Wellness is a nonprofit committed to the empowerment, health, and well-being of Black women and girls, and we use a reproductive justice framework. In a moment, we'll dive into reproductive justice for those of you who are not familiar with it. But in the meantime, we teamed up with the Center for Genetics and Society, as well as In Our Own Voice National Black Women's Reproductive Justice Agenda, to bring you this awesome webinar today. Just to share a little bit more about the flow of today's webinar, we are going to have a bit of background about reproductive justice, followed by a background information on where we are with genetics and gene editing. Marcy at the Center of Genetics and Society will be doing that, followed by our awesome panel of speakers. After, we will open it up for questions and answers. Just as Emily said, use the Q&A box to do for questions, and we will take as many as we can, but because of time. Without further ado, I'm going to hand it off to my colleague, Michelle, to share a bit about what reproductive justice is.
Thanks, Narbese. Hi, everyone. I'm Michelle Batchelor. I'm the Deputy Director here at In Our Own Voice National Black Women's Reproductive Justice Agenda, and I am just over the moon thrilled to be here with you all. It's very rare that I have an audience or an opportunity to talk with scientists and academics because at In Our Own Voice, you know, our primary objectives and goals are to really lift up and amplify the voices of Black women around reproductive justice issues. And we do that at a national, regional, and state level with 8 state partners that we have, one being Black Women for Wellness, who you just met, Narbese. So we do wonderful things, you know, and it is around the reproductive justice framework, and we wanted to give a little background because we do know not everyone on this call may be as familiar with reproductive justice, just as I am not as familiar with genetic editing. So, you know, reproductive justice comes out of a human rights frame and kind of was birthed in 1994, you know, started by Black women who were responding and participating in the reproductive rights movement, feminist movements that were happening at the time, you know, that were very much focused on abortion and, you know, as well as, you know, white-centered, you know, feminist, historical feminist movement. And, you know, it's really taking an intersectional look at the lives of In our case, we're really focused on Black women, women of color, women of all nationalities, and the intersections that influence how we choose to create family and our lived experiences and how that influences what our family makeup, our community would look like. And so, using that human rights frame, it really is, the principles are, it is the right to have children, it's the right to not have children, and it's the right to raise your children in safe and healthy environments. And so, with the work that we do within the reproductive justice movement is really try to work across all those intersections and look at economic justice as well as racial justice, incarceration and how that affects us, as well as, now I think this is a very timely discussion, and I'm looking forward to it because, genetics is not something that I have necessarily thought much about in the future and the technologies, but, I think as we are grassroots organizers and advocates really trying to affect policy, we're really concerned about, what the implications would be using the reproductive justice framework around policy and rights for women, for people, for Black women, and how that can be used to improve our health outcomes, how it can be used to improve maternal mortality rates, as well as, the ethical and human rights concerns that we would naturally have. And so, as we think about reproductive justice and go into this discussion of genetics, hopefully we're keeping in mind how we can marry the science with the advocacy effectively, learning from, our history, as well as, focusing on what we want people to have. And I know all of us on this call want people to have, live their best life free from stigma, free from discrimination, and how we can do that while we still move policy forward, move technology forward to meet the changing, evolving lived experiences that we all have. I'll leave it there.
So thank you, Michelle. Now that we all are on the same page about reproductive justice, we're going to take a moment to dive into genetics, part of the conversation. For many of us, we think designer babies, movies like Gattaca or The Island all seem like something way far in the future. It's something we don't have to worry about now. But is that really the case? Next, we have Marcy from the Center for Genetics and Society to share a bit about where we are and break down what is gene editing.
Okay, thanks so much, Nurbese and Michelle and all of you for being here. I'm thrilled to be with all of you today. A word about the Center for Genetics and Society. We are a public interest organization, and our mission is to work to bring a social justice and human rights perspective to the social challenges that human genetic technologies and assisted reproductive technologies raise. And gene editing for human reproduction is right at the center of our concern. So as Nurbese said, my role today is just to share some quick background with you about what gene editing is, how it's being talked about it, and who's talking about it and who's not. So the past few years have seen the development and the very rapid spread of a new generation of genetic engineering techniques that go by the term gene editing. So these gene editing tools can be used to add, to delete, or to change genetic sequences in any living organism. And they're more accurate and more controllable than previous genetic engineering techniques were, although they're not as accurate and controllable as the editing metaphor might suggest, and that's actually an important point. When we turn to considering the use of gene editing in human beings, there are two distinct categories to keep in mind. There's somatic gene editing and germline gene editing. And somatic gene editing, when used as a gene therapy, the aim is to treat existing people with certain conditions, people who are sick. And these changes would hopefully help the person being affected, but would not be passed down to any descendants of that person. There were clinical trials of gene therapy using the older genetic engineering method starting in 1990, but until recently there's been very little success and, in fact, some tragic outcomes of those experiments. Now, with the new techniques, more promising results may be emerging, and we can be hopeful about that. In contrast to somatic gene editing, germline gene editing refers to modifying the genes in eggs, in sperm, or in very early embryos. And if used for reproductive purposes, these changes would be passed down to any future generations. So what that means is that these changes would be reflected in every cell of the body of a child that was produced after these techniques were being used, and also in any of that child's descendants in the future. Genetically engineered animals have been created this way, so you get the glow-in-the-dark bunnies and the goats that can lactate spiders' webs, spider silk in their milk, and so on. But germline editing for reproduction has not been attempted in human beings, and that prospect and the conversation about it is the main focus of our webinar today. The best known of the gene editing tools is called CRISPR-Cas9. It's received a lot of attention over the past couple of years. In addition to greater accuracy, it's inexpensive, it's easy to use, and it's customizable. And there's been a particular focus, including by the media, on the prospect of using CRISPR in fertility clinics for human reproduction. In other words, to determine the genes and thus determine the traits of future children and future generations. So the slide that's now showing is the cover of the August 2015 issue of the Economist magazine. And this was just a few months after CRISPR burst onto the scene. And this is one of a number of very similar magazine covers and illustrations. So the title here is Editing Humanity, the Prospect of Genetic Enhancement. And the picture shows a white baby with playing with letter blocks with the letters A, T, G, and C. And it shows multiple arrows pointing to various parts of the baby's body. So the arrow pointing to the baby's leg reads sprinter, the one to the baby's hair reads no baldness, the one to the head reads high IQ and forehead, low risk of Alzheimer's, breast cancer, and stroke, to the left eye, 20/20 vision, and to the right ear, perfect pitch. So that's the promise that's being made, or the threat that's being made about germline gene editing for reproduction. This prospect raises a number of concerns. First is safety. There is a major issue of off-target edits or inaccurate edits, and this could lead to all sorts of negative outcomes. Even if a child who had been genetically modified seemed healthy at birth, they could develop serious problems later on, and some harms might only manifest themselves in subsequent generations. So the second point is that while some people argue that germline modification should be permitted but limited to prevention of transmitting serious inherited diseases, this argument, which is presented as a medical argument, but it's tenuous at best. There are other ways to accomplish the same thing, to have children not affected by serious genetic inherited diseases. Also, it seems dubious that germline modification could be restricted in the real world to serious medical conditions for a number of reasons. For starters, how would you distinguish therapy from cancer? What would count as a disease or a disability or normal human variation? And who would draw these lines? So these are questions that also come up around existing prenatal technologies that are able to identify fetuses or embryos with certain conditions. And historically, as well as currently, many assert that selecting against conditions, for example, Down syndrome and other disabilities, reinforces negative and discriminatory attitudes about disability rights and justice. And it's likely that human gene editing for reproduction would have the same effect, probably magnified. Additionally, we need to consider the commercial pressures that would come into play if germline editing for reproduction was to be permitted and marketed by fertility clinics. The assumption that there are bad genes and good genes would inevitably reflect existing prejudices, and this could all too easily lead to a future of genetic haves and have-nots, a world in which our already shameful social inequalities and discriminations are magnified. So those are, very briefly, some of the arguments against and concerns about human gene editing for reproduction. And I just want to end with a few words about existing policy. Internationally, gene editing for human reproduction is actually already prohibited by law in more than 40 countries. And these are countries that protect reproductive rights and that include most nations of the world with advanced biomedical sectors. Gene editing for human reproduction is also prohibited by a binding international treaty, and this slide shows the cover of a report on that treaty, which is it's called the Convention on Biomedicine and Human Rights, which the slide shows, and underneath that, the Oviedo Convention, another name for this treaty, and its additional protocols. Domestically, NIH and FDA recently reaffirmed that they won't fund or approve proposals for human germline modifications for reproduction, but the U.S. has no law that prohibits it. And even though public opinion in the U.S. has for years been consistently opposed to this, especially for enhancement or the creation of designer babies, there are also vocal advocates for moving in this direction, especially in the U.S. and the U.K. So the final point that I want to make is that this conversation, one landmark in this conversation was a big conference at the end of 2015 put on by the National Academies of Sciences and Medicine, 500 people in Washington, D.C. for 3 days. Ruha Benjamin, who we'll hear from for a moment, was invited to speak about the disability rights there. I was invited to talk from a public interest perspective, but overwhelmingly the attendees were scientists, and there were very few others, very few public policy advocates, social scientists, justice-oriented organizations, people with disabilities who were included either as presenters and even in the audience. In a concluding statement, the summit's organizing committee called for what they termed broad societal consensus before any use of human gene editing for reproduction. But unfortunately, since there have really not been any significant efforts toward engaging the public. And then in February of this past year, another National Academies Committee issued a report on gene editing that pretty much dispensed with the call for consensus and recommended that human gene editing for reproduction could proceed with certain limits. So all these and a bunch of others will be discussed by our speakers, and I'm going to now turn it back over to Norbese and ask Norbese, Lisa, Ruha, and Dorothy to enable your webcams, please. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Marcy. You left there kind of in a great space in talking about genetics, gene engineering, some of the policy, and the fact that we don't have many of our folks, many of the social scientists and reproductive justice folks in the room. So that is why we have this awesome panel today to kind of bring that perspective. So now, none of our speakers need to be introduced. Their work speaks for itself. All are superstars in the world of academia. I am super honored to first introduce our first speaker, though, for some of those who might not know, is Dr. Ruha Benjamin, who quite literally has her own chairing section here at BWW. We love her work. Ruha Benjamin is an assistant professor of African American Studies at Princeton University, and in 2016-2017 fellow at the Institute for Advanced Studies. Her work examines the social dimensions of science, technology, and medicine with a particular focus on the relationship between innovation and inequity. She earned her PhD in sociology from UC Berkeley and completed fellowships at UCLA's Institute for Genetics and Society and Harvard Science, Technology, and Society program. Ruha is the author of numerous publications, including People, Science, Bodies, and Rights on the Stem Cell Frontier, and is the recent recipient of the 2017 President's Award for a Distinguished Teacher at Princeton. And because I could spend the whole webinar just laying out the great work of the women on the panel, I'm going to stop there and let Ruha take it away.
Hi, everyone. So glad you could join us today. A big thanks to the Center for Genetics and Society, to Black Women for Wellness, and In Our Own Voice. They show, wonderful foresight in gathering us here today and thinking about issues that may not be on all of our radar. And I think, by the time something hits the headlines, we see it in New York Times, it's almost too late to start shaping the conversation and start shaping the debate. And so it's really important to actually engage issues that we might not immediately see as directly connected to, what's normally on our plate in terms of what our concerns are and our interests are. And so I was thinking for today, why is it important for people who are in the sciences and in working in social justice to really hone in on this nexus around genetic engineering? What does it mean to people across the spectrum in terms of, the kinds of things we care about? And one of the answers I started turning on is this idea that how we answer the question around which lives are worth living, which lives are worth bringing into being, and also by implication, which lives are worth extinguishing. How we answer that question at a biological level has direct implications for how we answer it in terms of the sociology of it, in terms of society. So it directly relates to how we invest in housing, how we invest in food, how we invest in education. So when we're talking about genetic engineering, it's not like this esoteric field that is going to have, is going to impact us down the line. Precisely how we begin to theorize and conceptualize, the answer to this, which lives are worth living, has implications for the things that we're working on right now. And so this is why I think the foresight of these organizations to get us together to begin talking about it and opening up the conversation beyond what I experienced in D.C. At the International Gene Editing Summit. And so to begin that conversation, one of the things I thought I would do is, think about not how the conversation is being framed, but what are the assumptions in the pre-frame? So the pre-frame of science, broadly speaking, but also the pre-frame of genetic engineering. What is taken for granted as ideas that we all somehow agree on when in fact we haven't had a conversation about it. There's been no widespread debate or deliberation. So I thought in my opening comments I would just highlight a couple of these assumptions, a couple of these ideas that are part of the pre-frame of genetic engineering. So one of the things that I experience on a routine basis as often one of the only social scientists in conversations around all kinds of innovations is the refrain, the public needs more scientific literacy in order to even begin the conversation. And so often the conversation, it's framed as a deficit, what the public lacks, and that how we have to meet that lack before we can engage as equal partners in thinking about the stakes of investing in a particular field or a particular technology. And often what I'm struck by is there's not an equal conversation, an equal kind of prioritization around how scientists and other kinds of experts would need to also develop a social literacy in order to adequately engage in this conversation. And so we think about what is social literacy, some of those elements. And I was thinking of just a few things that might go into a social literacy around genetic engineering, and it relates to other fields as well. And one of the key kind of starting at the foundation of the conversation, and that I think the reproductive justice movement really has been at the forefront of contributing and moving public discourse to engage, is troubling the very idea of choice, right? Choice as a straightforward good that has the same kinds of effects and meaning for people along the social spectrum, when we know, in fact, our personal choices can often reinforce dominant systems, or they can in some ways undercut them, depending on what we're choosing to do and in our own lives. And so this relates to some of Marcy's sort of points early on, that you think about choosing particular traits for a child. Well, we do that already in terms of, giving certain kinds of lessons or enhancements in terms of social opportunities. But with genetic engineering, we're talking about often, especially germline genetic engineering, we're talking about making choices for future generations. And so in many ways, sedimenting our current biases and our current ideals into people who have had no choice in the matter. And so reproductive justice, the entire movement, helps us in science understand that choice is not a simple kind of ideal that we can take for granted. We have to open up the black box of choice and say, whose choices are being prioritized and idealized, and unpack and trouble choice discourse more broadly. The second element of social literacy that I see as related to the conversation is often the way that the strict boundary between good uses of genetic engineering and bad uses of genetic engineering are drawn. We're often presented this as part of the pre-frame of the conversation as very clear-cut. We are not going to do the bad things, and we are going to invest in the good things. So one thing Marcy mentioned is that in many ways you can't control, once you let it out of the bag, whether things are going to be used for good or bad. So that's one element. But another element is that even the kinds of things we would put on either side of that boundary, enhancement, we wouldn't choose kids that are going to be taller or shorter, eye color, racial, melanin count, and so on. We wouldn't do that. Those social traits we wouldn't invest in. But we would invest in things that have to do with debilitating illnesses. That would go on the good side. Those would be the therapeutic uses, the good uses. And in fact, the boundary between therapeutic, good, enhancement, bad, is actually quite porous. And that porousness really becomes evident when we start to engage the disability justice movement in the conversation, where many of the things we might put on the bad side of are actually things that people have pride in and do not want to see extinguished. And so it essentially troubles the common sense that we have developed around this boundary between enhancement and therapy. So that's the second element of this social literacy. And the idea that, in fact, if we decide that we will only use genetic engineering for good therapeutic uses, we are likely to construct therapeutic justifications for the things we want to see happen, right? And so I can unpack that idea a little bit perhaps in Q&A, but the point being that the line is not stable. It's not a dark boundary. Things move on either side of that boundary, and that we're quite innovative in terms of justifying what we want to do. And if we see that a particular justification has traction, then we can find ways to employ that for the things we want to do. And then I guess the last point that I will not go into in more depth, but I want to just put on the table as part of really enhancing our social literacy around science, broadly speaking, genetic engineering specifically, is really for us to be quite honest and tackle the commercial context in which this is happening, right? In that people are motivated by all kinds of things. Yes, helping people who suffer from debilitating medical conditions is certainly a primary motivator, but there are all kinds of things that we wouldn't say are about the public interest, but are more about private interest that we need to keep on the table and become very honest about talking about and engaging in the conversation. And then the last element of social literacy that I would just sort of highlight is really expanding our notion of what governance of scientific technologies and technologies of all kinds can look like. I do not think that those who are producing the technologies can be the only ones to define the risks and benefits around investing in them. So one way to think about this is that the risks that scientists know best are not the only risks. There are social risks, political risks, that other kinds of experts, including people who work in reproductive justice, are better equipped to articulate and put on the table, and they have to be taken just as seriously as the medical risks that scientists define as important.
Well, thank you, Ruha. I'm sure there's a lot to to get into during the question and answer there. But to keep it flowing, we next have Dorothy Roberts, whose book Killing the Black Body sits on every Black woman's book stand, including my own. Dorothy Roberts is the George A. Weiss University Professor of Law and Sociology at the University of Pennsylvania, with appointments in the law school and the Department of Africana Studies and Sociology. Her book includes Killing the Black Body, Race, Reproduction, and the Meaning of Liberty, Shattered Bonds, The Color of Child Welfare, and Fatal Intervention, How Science, Politics, and Big Business Recreate Race in the 21st Century. She serves on the Center for Genetics and Society Advisory Board. And with that, take it away, Dorothy.
Thanks. Well, thanks to everybody for joining this really important conversation and to all that helped to organize it. I'm really thrilled to be part of it and to share the conversation with my co-panelists who are all such great experts on this topic and dedicated to reproductive justice. I want to reinforce what Ruha said about examining the assumptions that underlie the science. So often science is described as an objective field that doesn't take into account social biases, that's free from all the pressures from society and politics. And gene editing falls into a similar trap where there are many social assumptions that are hidden. And what we know about hidden social assumptions is that they usually benefit the most privileged people in society and harm the least privileged. And that is very true about the debate over gene editing. I'll focus on a few other points about it, beginning with the way in which the role of justice is framed by the dominant view that has been prominent in the debate over gene editing. That's really been controlled by the scientists. And from their point of view, the main issues are making gene editing safer and more accurate and more accessible. And as long as no one is physically harmed by it and it can be made more accessible to more people, it's seen as being just. That's the only problem with justice regarding gene editing, according to this view, is making the technology safer and more accessible and more accurate. But this assumes that there's a universal conception of human health and well-being that everybody shares, and that gene editing, if it's safe and accurate, is going to further that. Our reproductive justice approach refutes this idea that there's some objective universal project and progress in technology, and it contests the way in which gene editing imports unjust social assumptions and hierarchies. So, first of all, one way in which gene editing does this is that it operates in a context of longstanding oppression of women, of poor people, queer people, and people with disabilities, and in particular the devaluation of Black mothers. And we can look to the history of birth control as an example of what we can expect with gene editing, where birth control technologies, like gene editing, were proclaimed to be inherently liberatory. And all that was important is increasing access to these technologies. But what history shows us is that they actually have been used for decades to deny Black women and other women of color the right to have children. And if you don't take into account the systemic devaluation of Black mothers and the way in which these technologies have been used as forms of population control, you are not addressing the true justice in reproductive technologies. One of the major points of reproductive justice is that technologies should not be used to deny women the right to have children, especially when that denial is based on unjust hierarchies of race and class and gender. Secondly, the advocates of gene editing rely on changing the biology of individuals rather than changing the unjust structures of societies in which human beings live. So the people who have dominated the debate over gene editing have a vested interest in the belief that the reason why socially disadvantaged people have problems and are suffering is because of their inherent traits. And so the answer is to change their inherent traits rather than to change society. Gene editing focuses on individual enhancement rather than social change. Well, there's a big difference in the viewpoint of people who are oppressed by social structures and people who are privileged by them. People who are privileged by them have more of a stake in keeping things the way they are. And so you're not going to get a debate about gene editing or a view about the ethics of gene editing that takes into account its role in perpetuating social structures rather than relying on biological changes if you don't include the voices of the people who have a stake in social change. Right now, the dominant voices are people who don't have that stake in social change. Obviously, the debate would be very different if we included at the forefront the voices of people who understand, and this is what reproductive justice stands for, understands that human well-being and freedom relies on an equal society, not on tampering with biological differences. And then thirdly and relatedly, gene editing operates in the context of increasing neoliberal reliance on the market and the stripping of state support for human well-being. And so gene editing relies on a market-based procedures that focus on changing individuals' biology rather than relying on state-supported, people-led changes in society that provide generously for all people's human well-being. In the reproductive context, this reliance on the market has meant giving women the responsibility of ensuring the genetic fitness of their children. For example, eliminating genes that predict for children with disabilities rather than ending discrimination against people with disabilities. And it's led to pressuring women to use genetic technology in order to enhance dominant views of genetic fitness. Now, women of color are the most vulnerable to this kind of exploitation, both for them to use gene editing to control their children's traits. And it's not at all true that providing more access to women of color is going to
provide us more freedom. It could just mean that it will enhance the pressures on women of color in order to force them to use these technologies to produce the children that the state believes will be less of a burden on it. And it also can be used to exploit women's bodies, especially women of color's bodies, to be used in the reproductive marketplace. So a reproductive justice approach reveals that what might look like freedom of choice to use genetic editing, as Ruha pointed out, is actually the perpetuation of unjust social structures and hierarchies. And if we focus on dismantling unjust structures and hierarchies as the main way to achieve reproductive justice, the ethics of gene editing looks very, very different. And that's why we need to be at the forefront of debate about the ethics of these new technologies. I'll end there.
Thank you, Dorothy. I just want to remind folks that there is a question and answer box. If you have any questions that come up, we have one more panelist, and then we'll get into that space. Our final speaker, Lisa Ikemoto. Lisa is the person's work that I turn to when I'm first looking for how to talk about reproductive technologies and people of color's bodies. And I'm super appreciative of having someone right here in California in our backyard who's a leading mind on this work. Lisa is a Martin Luther King Jr. professor at UC Davis School of Law. She teaches bioethics, reproductive rights, law and policy, and health care law. She uses a critical race feminism to examine how race, gender, and class shape the development and use of emerging biotechnologies. Her recent work addresses reproductive tourism, the way in which human gametes use links, the fertility and biotechnology industries, and the privatizing effects of informed consent. Ooh, that was a lot. There, go ahead. So Lisa, take it away.
Thank you, and I want to echo everyone else's thanks to Black Women for Wellness, In Our Own Voice, and the Center for Genetics and Society. To pick up the conversation, I'm going to take sort of the great critical questions that Ruha and Dorothy raised, the framing questions, and also sort of the threads that they identified, and I'm going to try to bring us down to the ground. So I'm going to focus on how the use of CRISPR, other genetic modification tools, for germline modification purposes might come to be distributed. So I believe that if and when genomic modification of human embryos, eggs, and sperm rolls out, it will likely do so through fertility clinics as an add-on service to in vitro fertilization. So I'm going to start by providing a sketch of the fertility industry. I'm going to be using broad strokes with some qualifying language, but little nuance, which means I'm going to be generalizing quite a bit in order to sort of just set up the picture. So the fertility industry, which is based on the use of assisted reproductive technologies, it's a multi-billion-dollar industry. So this goes to the point about commercialization that Dorothy and Ruha have both raised. And typically, when we look at the use of assisted reproductive technologies from the outside, what we see is the doctor, the intended parent or parents, and the beautiful children who are conceived through technology use. The industry includes many other actors, and it's important to keep those in mind. Of course, there are the people who provide sperm and eggs for other use, the people we call donors, despite the fact that most of them are paid, the women who provide surrogacy services, and then there are also the sperm banks, the egg agencies, surrogacy centers, genetic testing labs, embryology labs, drug companies, professional organizations like the American Society for Reproductive Medicine, lawyers, and credit agencies, among others. The fertility industry is primarily, but not wholly, for-profit. The services are priced as luxury goods, as Deborah Sparr's work has shown. Many, but not all, of the centers and agencies that are the glue of this industry offer their services in ways that commodify humans and their attributes, including race,
religion, SAT scores, athletic ability, hobbies, and body mass index, just to name a few. The use of these technologies reflects tensions in how we define family or the families we accept as quote-unquote normal. There have been battles over access by people who are single, by LGBT folks, by people with disabilities. Access by people of color and lesbian and gay intended parents has been created more by formation of niche markets than by inclusion in mainstream markets. On the other hand, the industry has enabled family formation outside of the traditional marriage-based so-called opposite-sex family model, and so has challenged in that way, offered liberatory understandings of family. In the meantime, practices in the fertility industry reinforce and expand stratified reproduction. Shelley Colin showed how race, gender, class, and immigration status mark out and limit the roles that women from different groups can play in reproduction and family. Her work focused on who were the nannies and who were the mothers. Obviously, Colin's work also reminds us that stratified reproduction has a long history and has taken different forms in the U.S. In the present time, we often use assisted reproductive technology in ways that define specific limited roles for people who are participating in reproduction and family formation. We call them egg donors, sperm donors, surrogates, and intended parents. And the first three are situated as third parties, largely by contract, and therefore clearly situated as non-family. The fertility industry is globalized and fosters reproductive travel, a form of medical tourism. The major destination spots tend to be characterized by highly gendered social structures and economies, weak regulation, and developing nation status. So it's no surprise that when you hear about reproductive travel or these major destination spots, they include places like India or more recently Mexico. The industry is dependent, in other words, on inequality. So that being said, the U.S. is a major destination spot, in part because of weak regulation, but also because of at least three other factors that I want to mention. So the first is inequality, the resulting availability of women in financial need and the ability of others to pay out luxury good prices. Number two, the racial and ethnic diversity of our populace that makes it possible to offer eggs, sperm, and surrogates of every race for differing prices. And three, lack of restriction on genetic testing and selection, including sex selection. While most who use in vitro fertilization are not necessarily rich, there's an economic access divide. Because the labor markets are structured by race and gender, it means that single women, especially women of color, and lesbian couples are the least likely to have economic access to fertility services. The 21st century sense of family normalizes the practice of selecting race, selecting attributes like SAT score, and pricing people with those attributes. The way in which these technologies are offered keeps the idea of biological race alive and profitable. In addition, we've accepted with little question the role of commercial sperm banks and egg agencies in screening out donors based on social criteria, including disability and putative medical criteria. So these practices are all wrapped up in an explanation that mixes supply and demand, the market language, the rhetoric of gift, health, love, responsibility, and most of all, the language of choice. So neoliberalism or free market individualism has framed the practices in the way we see the issues. So now I'm going to move us down to gene editing and how it might roll out. So imagine that CRISPR has been used to modify several in vitro human embryos, and as a result, a baby has been born. And it's an apparently healthy baby. Current U.S. law prohibits the FDA from reviewing proposals to modify human embryos, although as Marcy mentioned, at least 40 other countries are prohibiting this use. For now, that effectively bans any genetic modification of human embryos. So my hypothetical seems a little unlikely, but the law in the U.S. is part of an appropriations bill that requires annual renewal. So the law could change in any renewal year. Or, given the fact that we have medical tourism, those who want in vitro fertilization with genomically modified embryos could go to another country. So here's an example, not with CRISPR, but with another genetic modification technology. In 2016, Dr. John Zhang announced the birth of the first baby born after conception with a modified embryo. And the technology used was maternal spindle maternal spindle transfer, a type of mitochondrial transfer. And I won't explain that technology now. It's a different tool and it's a different type of genomic modification than CRISPR. Because U.S. law prohibits this in the U.S., the New York-based team sent the intended parents to the New Hope Clinic in Mexico, and the justification was therapeutic. So they used this line that Ruha referred to earlier. The focus of the 2016 announcement was that the procedure was a success and the baby was healthy. There was no significant evidence offered to show that, but almost immediately mitochondrial replacement was offered and or approved in a number of other countries. The New Hope Clinic itself announced plans for 20 more mitochondrial replacement babies, and in the Ukraine, mitochondrial replacement was used not to address a mortal disease, but as a fertility method, thus dropping the therapeutic justification. So this new technology, unapproved in many countries, became commercially available within weeks. So I think this illustrates a likely pathway for germline modification by CRISPR. Germline modification would become an enhanced form of genetic selection offered as an add-on service to in vitro fertilization to those who can afford it. And that would widen the door for eugenic selection. Eugenics has a long history and has taken different forms in the U.S. over the years. In most of them, the idea of the social good has justified imposing reproductive control to achieve social control over certain populations, most often defined by race, disability, poverty, and national origin. But eugenics can also result from privilege, the privilege of purchasing genetic choice. So even if the last point I want to make is that even if genomic modification is not used to create so-called designer babies, it's still likely to be used in a setting that feeds the idea that biological race is real and that perpetuates stratified reproduction. So I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you. So we are now moving into, well, first I want to thank all the speakers for giving us that background and kind of laying the foundation for a conversation for us to have. With that being said, we are moving into our question and answer, but I'm going to take a little bit of moderator's privilege and ask my question, or a couple of questions first. Again, just to remind folks, use the Q&A box, I think on your right-hand side on your computer in order to put in questions. But my question has to do, well, it's actually to all the panelists, but I'm going to start with Lisa and work my way backwards. All of you all talked about reproductive justice and social justice folks not being at the table. So I'm wondering who is at the table and who are the folks making making these decisions, and if there's any insight on the framework on which they are bringing these decisions into, or is there any framework at all that they're using in trying to make these decisions about what technology should be moving forward? So I'll start with
I'm sorry, I thought you were asking Ruha. Who's at the table? So far as Marcy mentioned, it seems like it's been primarily scientists at the Gene Editing Summit, and since then, it's been interesting. I think from the perspective of institutional science, the belief seems to be that they're being more inclusive than other. And that may be true, but that's a sad comment on how previous conversations have taken place. So it's true that there have been, people like Ruha have been speaking up, and Dorothy and certainly many others of us have been trying to get our voices in the door, but the formal conversations are largely taking place sort of indoors within those institutions. So I don't know if anybody else wants to add anything to that.
Well, I'll add one aspect of it, which is in my limited experience being part of the conversation as part of the stem cell research program in California, and part of the standards working group that's looking at the ethics of that. I found that the voices that are added outside of science the regular people that will be affected by gene editing tend to be patient advocates. So I think there's this sense that there's scientists and then there's the people who are going to be affected by gene editing, and those people are patients and they're advocates. And what the people who are turned to then are, I think, carefully selected ones who are looking to gene editing as a way of addressing certain diseases, illnesses, disabilities. And so they almost are using a way to shut down criticism of gene editing because they're not scientists, they're people who have very sympathetic situations, but they're not the disability rights movement that questions more critically the way in which gene editing can be used to discriminate against and devalue people with disabilities and substitute for ending that discrimination. And so that's just one piece of how I've experienced the debate supposedly widening, but widening to people who support the idea of gene editing as a solution for illness and disease and disability, as opposed to more critical voices.
And I would underscore Dorothy's last comment. Can everyone hear me? Just nod, because I did a little unmute. Okay. And another way to sort of think about it is that the public is included often, but it's a highly curated public, and one that often has to pass a litmus test of already fully supporting the agenda as it's been given. And so there's often a very low tolerance for raising to these critical questions among those who are putting, and this is not simply about gene editing, but it grows out of my research on stem cell research and stem cell initiatives, where there is a public that's included. It is a patient advocacy public that is, strongly supportive for very many good reasons of the science, but it often has the effect of shutting down other counter publics who might raise other types of questions that are really valid to the conversation.
Yes. And just really quickly, because all three of you all mentioned this conference that happened, could someone tell us, for folks who don't know what this conference is, that it seems like all of you are at, what the conference is? And I don't know who would be the best person to speak about it, but maybe Lisa or Dorothy or Ruha, about this conference that folks were at where none of us happened to be there, but you all were there when talking about gene editing.
Sure, I won't go into it in depth. It was called the International Summit on Gene Editing, although the extent to which it was international was questioned all along. It was, I believe, co-sponsored by the National Academies of Science, the UK Royal Society, and the Chinese Academy of Science. And the names of those might be a little off in my presentation. But it's a quick Google. You can find the entire proceedings, video proceedings, the text that came out of it online for those who want to learn more about it.
Thank you. Hey, so to follow up a little bit on that, this actually question is for Dorothy. Given the already complicated history around scientific development and women's colors of bodies, are there any historical faiths that you can bring that, any historical precedent that we can look to kind of show, if we don't kind of add our voices to this conversation, where it might be going? And I know you talked a little bit about birth control. Is there any other spaces that we can look at?
Yeah, well, one might be the contest over addressing coerced sterilization, where there was an assumption that increasing access to sterilization would
be beneficial to women, and that left out the experiences of Black women, Latino women, Native American women, other women of color who had been victimized by state programs to sterilize them. And so the involvement of women of color in that debate and also in advocating for regulations that would end or at least reduce, I mean, they didn't work to end it, but at least they were some intervention in what was rampant sterilization abuse of women of color, was critical. So that's one historical example. Another is the way in which the history of eugenics has been co-opted by conservative anti-abortion advocates, even using Black women's experiences to shame Black women and to promote the view that Black women, by having abortions, are committing genocide against their own people, promoting the message that Black women's wombs are the most dangerous place for African Americans. This was part of a billboard campaign that went up, and I think without Black women being involved in challenging those efforts, which also included legislation both at the state and national level to restrict abortions by women of color, again, on grounds that they discriminated against girls or against Black children, without the intervention using a reproductive justice focus on these laws and advocacy efforts, many people might be fooled into thinking that denying women access to abortion services, which are medical, healthcare services that women have a human right to access, they might have thought that this was some kind of social justice effort. So I could give other examples, but those are two where the intervention of women of color, and in particular Black women, has been absolutely essential to understanding the social justice implications of the regulation of technologies and access to technologies. Again, as I was trying to emphasize in my comments, access by itself doesn't mean anything if it's access to an unjust structure. So in these cases, whether we're talking about access to technologies or restrictions to those technologies, you have to look at what are the underlying social assumptions and what are the implications, what's the impact for social structures and hierarchies to get to whether they're just or not. They're not either just by themselves, and without that attention, they can be, and historically, reproductive technologies have been used to harm and control as much as they've been used to liberate.
Thank you. There was a question from the webinar, and I'm just going to read it. My own experience is that many people in the research or science elite, as well as regular people who may feel they don't know much, have an instinctive understanding of how complicated it is to talk about the so-called good or bad and use and how access issues and hierarchies affect it. Does anyone know of recent survey, research, or focus groups or other opinion work that specifically asks women and men of color, people with disabilities, and others about their own views about somatic and germline editing? It seems like there would be a rich area to explore. And I'll shoot that one to Ruha.
I was looking at that question and just thinking, I don't know off the top of my head one survey or, research project that encompasses all of that. I've seen much smaller scale, sort of often qualitative studies, but my first inclination is that would be such a valuable sort of starting point, just to kind of have a survey
that tries to gauge kind of where people are at. And then a follow-up question that I noticed, coming here on the side panel is, what forums or settings do we see as important for broadening the conversation beyond just sort of scanning or surveying the field? And one of the things I was thinking about, just thinking about my own engagement with Black Women for Wellness and the kind of ongoing work this organization and others like it are engaged in, is that, for a genuine conversation, you meet people where they're at. And so oftentimes with sort of the way that federal funding is tied to forms of public engagement, we stage events, we stage programs that are meant to have a wide representation, but there's such a strong selection effect in terms of people who show up to these or who are invited to these often, these invitation-only kind of public fora, that I think we want to push beyond that level of deliberation and meet people where they're at and think about, if, say example, Black Women for Wellness has a monthly breakfast that people in my neighborhood of South Central LA come to. And sort of, something that community folks are already going to, and connecting the issue of genetic engineering with things that people care about already. I think oftentimes if someone is already gung-ho about something like genetic engineering, that is one population, often a very small population, but there's a lot of people for whom this field will impact and has meaning and the stakes are high for them, but that connection hasn't been made yet. And so I would think that we want to engage more in terms of people who don't even see this as an issue yet, but who will likely be affected whether they realize or not. And one way to do that is to have more robust relationships with organizations that have been working in communities all along and not kind of helicoptering in when it suits our research to sort of find out what people know, as opposed to building these more lasting conversations. So that's one set of thoughts around that.
Mm-hmm. Just to add a little bit, I really, really want to support what Ruha is saying, that surveys are good. That should be a starting point, but this is really an issue of engagement. Many people don't believe they can engage with science because they haven't been given opportunities to do that, and there's such a myth and mystique surrounding what scientists do in U.S. culture that says they have absolute authority and other people can't possibly understand what they're doing. And that is such a dominant view that it's important to break through that, as Ruha's work, People Science, and other work has done. But it can't, it has to be done by engaging with people about the struggles and issues they're facing right now and explaining that it's okay to criticize science. I think, as all of us have been saying, that's one form of knowledge, and it's not immune from bias. But there are other forms of knowledge that are just as important. And that message is going to take a lot of organizing and movement work to get across, in addition to then raising up the voices of people who now have been, understand better how they can participate.
Mm-hmm. So another question from the webinar participants is, can any of you comment on how the fetishization of the quote-unquote other contributes to genetic modification and gene editing? I don't know who would be best to answer that question. Lisa, do you want to try it?
I can start, I think. I think in part, you have to think about who the other is, right, that's being created by the possibility of genetic selection and genetic selecting out, right? That's what we're talking about, is drawing lines between. It's a question that Ruha introduced at the beginning. Who are we saying, whose lives are we saying are worth saving and protecting, and whose lives are we saying are not? And as this technology is implemented, we have a chance, I think, to push back against the dominant sort of assumptions behind that. That's why I think the opening questions were so important in this conversation. So I think as it stands now, the conversation is assuming that people with serious illnesses and people with certain disabilities are the other in this conversation. And then to build on what sort of the history that Dorothy introduced before, right, this idea that we should and could do this has a long history. The choices that we've made over time about sort of whose lives should be protected and whose lives should not may have shifted from time to time. So, for example, when I've written a little bit about the sort of coerced and forced sterilization that took place not during the early 20th century, but primarily during the 1960s and 1970s across the United States. The populations actually varied from region of the country within the United States. So, for example, on the West Coast, it was largely Latinos who were not receiving public support. In the South, it was largely low-income black women who were receiving public support. In the Northeast, it was more likely to be Puerto Rican women, and in some parts of the country, including the Midwest, it was more likely to be white, low-income women. So who is other, right? This is from place and time. And I think we have to keep our eye on the ball. But right now, I think that the justification that's being used is a therapeutic justification. And that may change, and it may change very quickly, just as it did in the mitochondrial replacement example that I gave. But there also might be, because it's shifting, we have the opportunity, I think, to try to shape that conversation.
Mm-hmm. Just to follow up on that question of who are the others, usually when we look at, or the conversation around gene editing has to do with, okay, then it's going to be eugenics and they're going to edit out people of color, right? Which is like people's worst case scenarios. And I guess the question is that really the case? Because there was also a conversation about commoditization of people of color traits. And so I guess this question is to Ruha. How does that, is there another way that we can look at the conversation, right, when we talk about commoditization of people's bodies? And is it the extreme only, the eugenic space where they kind of gene edit disabilities and race, or is there other conversations that are just as tangled and we should be wary of?
Yeah, I mean, I think the kind of skill set that we need is this kind of adaptability in terms of what we look out for and what should concern us, and not assume that the way in which scientific harms got enacted in the past is the same way it's going to get enacted in the present or future. There's a kind of adaptability to harm so that our critique of it has to be as adaptable, right? And so one of the things I think we should look out for, and there's already precedent for this, but I think one direction that we should really sort of keep in mind is that often we presume eugenic harms will be enacted by trying to get rid of undesirable traits, and that those undesirable traits will be mapped onto social groups that are already subordinated and already oppressed, and that the primary approach will be to lessen that group, lessen those traits. And certainly that's been, there's a lot of precedent for that. But I think what we also see as a kind of subtext all along that may, in fact, characterize the way in which genetic engineering takes shape in the future it is more along the lines of, again, thinking about this word that the person used in terms of fetishization, in terms of particular kinds of traits associated with subordinate groups becoming desirable in interesting ways and therefore commercially lucrative, so that people want to capitalize on creating more of that. We see in the cultural sphere, we see that in terms of cultural appropriation, for example, in which
white culture appropriates those selectively, those particular cultural traits or behaviors that are seen as fashionable at any given moment, and that there's a lot of attention and investment in that. And often the people who originated that or who are the primary protagonists of that do not benefit at all or nearly as much as the dominant group when they use that. And we might see something similar in terms of how this affects, genetic engineering in that, we think of, let's say, a climate change. There's, I mentioned to my colleagues on the panel here about this new short science fiction film that sort of takes the premise of climate change and shows that the severe heat makes melanin a highly commoditized trait, so that there are melanin extraction clinics all around the country, and those people who are experiencing poverty sell their melanin to the clinics in order to get some kind of compensation, and the primary people who are purchasing the melanin are white people. In that case, blackness is not an undesirable trait. It's desirable, it's commoditized, and it's exploited. And so I think, we see Lisa's work really highlights this in terms of IVF, but we see precedent in terms of the way that scientific harms may present a particular quality or trait as desirable, but the people who have that do not benefit from that desirability, right? They, in a the exploitive context means that they then are subject to different forms of oppression precisely because what they have is valued. And so we shouldn't conflate a quality that is valued with the people being valued who have that quality, I think.
Yeah. All right. So there is several questions about kind of what can we do as listeners, as scientists, as academics, as healthcare professionals. And Ruha talked a little bit about diving into communities, right, and linking up with communities. But is there any conversation or space in which folks who are listening can get engaged, or how would they do that, and what demands should we be asking healthcare professionals, scientists, and academia with this conversation? Yeah, I'll leave that there. And I'll shoot that first to Dorothy Roberts.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think organizing on a number of levels is important. So one level that we talked about a little bit just a moment ago was working with organizations that are already promoting social justice in various ways. I think this webinar is an example of 3 organizations getting together to address the issue of gene editing and reproductive justice. I firmly believe that it's much more effective for people to work collectively than individually. So I think individually we can all become more educated by reading what's available on gene editing and the critiques of gene editing, but it's really important to work with organizations that are already either focused on reproductive justice or genetic issues, like the organizations organizing this, but also, and this is a key aspect of reproductive justice, is connecting with organizations that are not focused on those particular topics, but we understand how they are addressing interlocking forms of oppression. So organizations that are dealing with criminal justice, for example, disability rights, economic justice, health justice, all of those intersect with gene editing, and all of those movements can be harmed by a focus on gene editing as the solution to social inequalities. So that's a sort of broad way of talking about it, but I think that collaboration among social justice organizations on this issue is really key.
Mm-hmm. I would, do you mind if I just add a little footnote to?
Yeah. Oh, go on.
No, I strongly, just support that idea of collaborative work, groups working on different things, coming together around this. And one thing I feel like we could all do, like as soon as we get off this call, no matter what our sphere of influence is to really begin to seriously tackle the kind of scientific exceptionalism that prevents people from engaging this in the first place. And so one way that I tend to think of it is like, people don't feel like they need training as an economist to have a voice when it comes to things that have to do with work and employment and economic issues. There's not a sense that if I'm not an expert, if I don't have degrees in this, I can't say anything meaningful about it, right? We don't do that with other things. We don't think, oh, I need to be trained in political science to have any worthwhile ideas about what's happening in politics. No, everyone feels that the implications of stakes are, they have something to say. And I think we need to do that same kind of cultural work in terms of shifting discourse, shifting how people feel they can meaningfully contribute, and say, you don't need a degree in this in order to contribute meaningfully. It won't be the same contribution as a scientist or as someone trained in this particular field, but you have something meaningful to contribute to the conversation. And so I think that kind of shift, we have to begin to do it no matter our sphere of influence. Otherwise, we'll continue to run up against this idea that, I'm not a scientific person. I'm not a sciencey person, right? So that's too heavy. I can't get into that, right? And sort of the reluctance, the ambivalence, the fear even to even tread into these conversations. And I think that's something we can all, begin to do, is tackle that scientific exceptionalism to say that, we all have a meaningful stake in this. And so we all need to be able to think. And in fact, we might even think someone who's not trained as an economist would have something, different and worthwhile, something completely different than someone in that field would have, right? It's a valuable contribution precisely because you're not trained in it. You can see things that that person cannot. And I think we can make a similar shift to say precisely because this is not your entire livelihood is caught up in the advancement of this field, you actually might have more objectivity towards contributing to this than someone who is trained in that. And so it shifts the stakes in terms of who should be talking about this.
I just add one more thing to cap that. Ultimately, these questions are not about science and technology. They're about people. They're about us and our lives, how we're valued.
So with that, because I know we're at time, but I wanted to give about 30 seconds to each panelist for if they had any final thoughts to share with us as we wrap up this webinar. Again, thank you. I'll do another thank you in a minute, but 30 seconds, and I'll start with Lisa, then we'll do Dorothy and Ruha.
Just in my last 30 seconds, what I would go back to is that maybe what's different about the questions that we're facing now that we haven't seen as clearly in history is that this is all highly commercialized. And in the market, there's a very sort of big slippage between sort of desire and all the way to need, right? We make that transition very easily as consumers in the market. And that's part of what happens with these technologies. And the industry relies on that. We should be challenging that.
I would say that even though there are lots of changes in how our society is organized and how science operates and the technologies, there is a basic philosophy of gene editing that is consistent with prior ways of thinking that we've seen cause all sorts of harm. And that is the reliance on changing individuals' biology instead of changing unjust social structures. And that's the aspect of reproductive justice that I think is so important to add to this debate and
to how we're going to deal with these technologies in the first place, that reproductive justice focuses on changing society in order to ensure human rights and well-being, not changing individuals' biology. I think if we keep that framework in mind, it will help us think much better and act much better about the ethics of gene editing.
I guess I won't use the whole 30 minutes. I'll just use 30 seconds. I'll just use 3 words that come out of some current discourse, especially through social media when we talk about these issues, and that is trust Black women.
Amen.
So I want to say a big thank you to the panelists, to the fellow co-sponsors, the Center for Genetics and Society, and in our own voice, Black Women's Reproductive Justice Agenda. Of course, again, this is Nervese from Black Women for Wellness. I do want to plug the books again. We have Ruha Benjamin's book, People, Science, Bodies and Rights on the Stem Cell Frontier. Amazing book. I actually have it right in front of me. Fatal Intervention and Killing the Black Body was
Just what is Fatal Invention?
Fatal Invention. I'm sorry.
You might have the
I'm
right
also looking at the book too, right? Fatal Invention and Killing the Black Body. With Dorothy Roberts, who did some of her information, and Lisa, you can find her information. Great work online, particularly around egg donorship. I thank you for being involved in this conversation. I know we didn't get a chance to get to all of the questions, and we need to have more spaces to have these conversations. Another seamless plug, Black Women for Wellness, with the Center of American Progress, will be hosting a science fiction, and comics pre-conference for October 4th in New Orleans, right before Let's Talk About Sex Reproductive Justice Conference. So more details about that soon, but this is one of the conversations we wanted to talk about, linking the science fiction and science intersection, particularly with the social justice lens. Again, this conversation has a lot to dive into. We hope you'll come back. We'll hope you plug into your organizations. If you would like, please stay on for a couple of minutes afterwards. You'll see a survey that pops up when we close out. And if you can take the survey, if you like more details or connected to the organization, pop your email in there, and we can get you connected to some of the organizations that are doing this work. So with all of that, thank you again, and next time.